It was a busy morning at the airport, the kind where every gate seemed packed with travelers clutching coffee cups, balancing laptops, and shuffling through papers. The hum of conversation blended with the occasional beeping of boarding announcements, creating a rhythm that was both chaotic and ordinary. Among the passengers waiting to board the flight, there was one man whose presence might have gone unnoticed to most, a man whose calm demeanor and composed posture suggested confidence, but nothing that screamed power or influence. Yet, beneath that quiet exterior, he carried a life of tremendous responsibility and achievement, a life that had earned him respect in boardrooms and corporate circles, even if it wasn't immediately visible to strangers on a crowded airplane. He was about to face an unexpected challenge, one that would test his composure in a way that no meeting or negotiation ever had. As the boarding process began, passengers moved forward, scanning their boarding passes and finding their assigned seats. The CEO walked steadily down the aisle, focused on the small details that often go unnoticed, ensuring his laptop bag was securely tucked, checking that his papers remained organized, and briefly noting the polite smiles of the flight attendants. There was a rhythm to his movements, a quiet efficiency, that contrasted sharply with the chaos around him. Every step seemed measured, deliberate, as though he was not just navigating the plane, but asserting control over a moment in time that demanded both patience and vigilance. Yet, despite all his focus, he couldn't foresee the sudden disruption that was about to occur. As he approached his row, he noticed a passenger sitting in his assigned seat, a white man, appearing casual, with an air of entitlement that was subtle but unmistakable. The man looked relaxed, almost too comfortable, as if the seat belonged to him rather than someone else. There was no immediate acknowledgement of the boarding pass, no polite glance to confirm he was in the right place. It was a small gesture that, under normal circumstances, might have been dismissed, a simple misunderstanding, a mix-up that happens frequently on crowded flights. But there was something about the way this passenger sat, the slight arrogance in his posture, that immediately registered to the CEO as a challenge. Not just a logistical challenge, but a personal one, a silent declaration that he was willing to disregard others for his own convenience. The CEO stopped a few steps from the seat, taking a moment to assess the situation. His mind, trained for high-stakes decision-making, instantly began cataloging the possibilities. He could simply request that the man move, a simple, polite correction. He could alert the flight attendant, enlisting the authority of the airline to restore order. Or he could choose to handle it silently, letting the man realize the error on his own. But even as he considered these options, there was a deeper instinct at play, one that had been honed over years of navigating a world where appearances and assumptions often misled people. He knew that beneath this casual act of disregard lay a subtle message, a test of authority, a challenge to his dignity. And though it was just a seat on a plane, the principle mattered. As he approached the man, he maintained a calm, measured tone, allowing the situation to unfold naturally rather than forcing it with overt confrontation. He positioned himself just beside the passenger, carefully holding his boarding pass for a clear view. The man glanced up, momentarily caught off guard by the presence of someone claiming authority over the seat. For a brief second, there was recognition in the man's eyes, a flicker of uncertainty, but it quickly vanished, replaced by a polite smile that didn't quite reach the eyes, a smile that suggested he thought he could handle the situation without consequence. The CEO, however, was not swayed by politeness or the superficial gestures of civility. He was attuned to the unspoken cues, the subtle indications of respect or its absence, and he recognized the importance of establishing his presence without escalating unnecessarily. Passengers around them began to notice the interaction, some craning their necks to see what was happening, others discreetly observing while pretending to read or check their phones. There was a tension in the air, subtle but palpable, as if the seat itself had become a stage for a silent negotiation of power. The CEO's calm demeanor contrasted with the passenger's initial assumption of entitlement, creating a dynamic that was quietly electrifying. The moment, though seemingly small, a single seat on a plane, held significance that extended far beyond the physical space. It was about recognition, about dignity, about the principle that no one should take what belongs to another without acknowledgement or respect. As he prepared to address the situation, the CEO's mind was already moving ahead, anticipating reactions and potential outcomes. He understood the psychology of confrontation, the way people respond to perceived authority, and the subtle techniques that can assert control without overt aggression. He could have resorted to impatience, to a stern tone that would immediately demand compliance, but he knew that true authority often speaks in quiet, deliberate actions rather than loud proclamations. His approach was precise, measured, and strategic, a reflection of a life spent navigating challenges where patience and observation often proved more powerful than force or anger. Despite the initial shock of seeing someone occupying his assigned seat, the CEO maintained an outward calm that few could mistake for anything but confidence. It wasn't that he lacked emotion, he felt a ripple of irritation, a prickling awareness that his space had been violated, but he understood the importance of controlling how that emotion manifested. Years of experience in corporate leadership had taught him that reactions reveal character, and a hasty or visible display of frustration could undermine the authority he had built over decades. He knew the stakes of every interaction, and even something as seemingly trivial as a seat on a plane was not exempt from his consideration. He was keenly aware that dignity is not just about status, but about the ability to command respect through measured action rather than loud declaration. As he stood near the aisle, he observed the passenger more closely. There was a subtle arrogance in the way the man leaned back, feet crossed comfortably, and arms resting casually on the armrests. It was a posture that implied ownership, a silent assertion that the seat, and by extension, the situation, belonged to him. Most people might have brushed this off as mere habit or obliviousness, but the CEO could sense the underlying assumption of superiority. It was an assumption that had been challenged countless times in his career, and he had learned to detect it instantly. He understood that the passenger's demeanor was not accidental, it was a reflection of entitlement, a belief that social niceties and fairness were optional when they did not suit him. The CEO allowed a moment of silence to stretch, creating a pause that carried its own weight. In this brief interval, he was calculating his approach. He could have interrupted the passenger directly, demanding he vacate the seat, but he knew that confrontation too early would only trigger defensiveness. Instead, he employed a tactic he had perfected over years of negotiation, the silent assertion of presence. By standing nearby with composed confidence, holding his boarding pass with deliberate clarity, he established his claim without raising his voice. The subtle power of this gesture was not lost on those around him. Passengers in the surrounding rows glanced over, sensing the tension and anticipating an unfolding conflict. The quiet patience of the CEO was, in itself, a signal that he was aware, in control, and not to be underestimated. At the same time, he allowed his body language to convey authority without aggression. Shoulders relaxed but upright, hands visible and unthreatening, eyes steady yet observant, every aspect of his posture communicated confidence and calm vigilance. It was a delicate balance, the line between assertive and confrontational, and he navigated it with instinct honed over countless high-pressure interactions. He understood that this balance was critical. If he overreacted, he would cede the moral high ground, but if he underreacted, he would allow the passenger's disregard to go unchallenged. In essence, he was turning the situation into a test of character, not just for himself, but for the person who had assumed his space was negotiable. As he prepared to speak, he considered the choice of words carefully. Tone, cadence, and phrasing all mattered. He could choose directness, politely but firmly indicating that the seat was his, or he could employ a subtle strategy that allowed the passenger to realize the error on his own. There was power in letting someone recognize their mistake without the need for aggressive enforcement. Often, people respond more effectively to situations that compel introspection, where their own actions reveal the oversight rather than being dictated by external authority. The CEO had learned to leverage these moments, transforming minor conflicts into opportunities to assert respect while maintaining personal composure. Meanwhile, the passenger remained unaware of the depth of the moment. To him, it might have seemed like a simple misunderstanding, a minor inconvenience in the grand scheme of boarding a flight. But the CEO's presence carried an invisible weight, one that could not be measured by seat numbers or flight etiquette alone. It was the weight of achievement, of earned authority, of a life where personal and professional boundaries were clear and respected. The passenger had assumed that a casual act would go unnoticed, failing to recognize that he had crossed a line. The CEO's calm vigilance was a quiet but unmistakable reminder that respect is not given, it is acknowledged, observed, and enforced through both presence and action. Around them, other passengers began to sense the tension, feeling it in subtle ways. A shift in posture here, a slightly diverted gaze there, small movements that signaled awareness without interference. The CEO's controlled demeanor contrasted sharply with the passenger's casual assumption, creating a dynamic that drew attention without drama. Even in this public, crowded setting, the principles of respect, authority, and dignity were being tested. The flight attendants, moving down the aisle with practiced attention, noted the interaction discreetly, their trained eyes picking up on the subtle cues of conflict resolution in progress. In that moment, the CEO's mind was fully present, cataloging reactions, anticipating responses, and evaluating the potential impact of every small action. He understood that dignity could be defended quietly, without spectacle, and that the effectiveness of his approach would rely on precision, patience, and the unwavering projection of authority. The passenger had unknowingly stepped into a situation far larger than the immediate inconvenience of seating. What seemed trivial, a mere matter of a chair, was, in reality, a clash of principle, a confrontation of respect, and a test of personal boundaries that the CEO was fully prepared to navigate. As the moment stretched on, the tension in the aisle began to build subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. Passengers nearby continued their own boarding routines, yet many were now quietly aware that something was unfolding that went beyond the usual minor inconveniences of air travel. The CEO, standing beside his assigned seat, remained composed, his posture unyielding yet relaxed, a careful balance of authority and calm. His eyes, however, were sharp and observant, taking in every detail of the situation, the passenger's shifting expressions, the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his hands gripped the armrests as if to claim unearned ownership. Every micro-movement spoke volumes, and the CEO, trained to read both people and circumstances, recognized each as an unspoken signal of discomfort and hesitation, even if the passenger himself had not yet realized it. There was an almost imperceptible change in the air, a shift that occurs when one person's composure meets another's assumption of entitlement. The white passenger, who had initially leaned back as though the seat were his personal domain, began to sense that his position was being questioned. It started as a flicker of awareness, a brief glance upward, a hesitant adjustment of posture, but that flicker quickly grew into a subtle unease. The CEO's calm presence was not just a physical fact, it carried an invisible weight, a quiet insistence that the space around him, both literal and metaphorical, was not to be taken lightly. This was not about confrontation for the sake of ego, it was about a principle that he had lived by for years: dignity, once challenged, demanded recognition. The tension began to escalate slowly, almost imperceptibly, as the flight attendants moved closer, attending to other passengers yet fully cognizant of the interaction taking place. The CEO's strategy was unfolding perfectly. He was patient, measured, allowing the situation to develop in real time while maintaining control. Every second of hesitation from the passenger reinforced the CEO's authority. The subtle interplay of glances and body language became a silent dialogue between the two men, one unspoken but profoundly impactful. It was a psychological dance, each waiting for the other to make a move, each aware that the outcome would hinge not on physical power, but on perception, awareness, and presence. As the minutes passed, the CEO allowed himself a moment of internal reflection, cataloging the scenario not as a minor inconvenience but as a test of character, his own and that of the man in the seat. In corporate life, he had encountered countless situations where appearances deceived, where entitlement masqueraded as confidence, and where patience and observation yielded far greater outcomes than force or overt confrontation. Here, on a crowded airplane, the stakes were different in scale but not in principle. He understood that escalation was not necessary, the tension itself, carefully managed, would often compel recognition without a single raised voice. The passenger had assumed that casual disregard would suffice, but he had not accounted for the subtler forms of authority, the kind that manifests through presence, poise, and quiet insistence. The man in the seat began to shift more noticeably now, a subtle tightening of shoulders, a brief frown, a hesitant glance sideways that betrayed a growing awareness that he was, in fact, in the wrong. It was fascinating to the CEO how quickly micro-expressions could reveal true acknowledgement of a situation. Even without words, he could see that the passenger was processing the reality that the seat had a rightful owner, and that owner was not someone to be dismissed or underestimated. The CEO's eyes remained steady, his posture unchanged, but the silent message had been delivered: the situation was under control, and respect would be demanded, not shouted, but unmistakably present. Other passengers, observing quietly, began to sense the unfolding dynamic, a mixture of curiosity and fascination. Some shifted slightly in their seats to get a better view, others exchanged subtle glances, recognizing that an ordinary flight had become a stage for a demonstration of authority, dignity, and subtle power dynamics. The CEO was acutely aware of the attention, though he did not alter his behavior to perform. His actions were natural, instinctive, and deliberate. There was an art to this escalation, an understanding that true power does not need dramatics, that respect is often most effectively commanded through restraint and observation rather than confrontation. The passenger now adjusted his position more significantly, lifting himself slightly as if to regain some sense of control. But the CEO's calm, unyielding presence had already shifted the balance. It was remarkable how quickly a minor act of entitlement, a simple assumption of someone else's seat, could transform into a silent struggle over principle and acknowledgement. The CEO had mastered such dynamics in boardrooms, during negotiations, and in high-pressure situations where stakes were far higher, yet here, in the confined space of an airplane, the same lessons applied: authority manifests not through aggression, but through clarity, confidence, and strategic patience. Each passing second reinforced the psychological tension. The passenger's initial confidence was eroding, replaced by subtle signs of discomfort and recognition. The CEO's measured approach allowed the man to confront his own misjudgment internally, to process the reality that he had overstepped and that the consequences were quietly but unmistakably present. This escalation, subtle yet powerful, relied entirely on the CEO's ability to remain composed while projecting an invisible but undeniable insistence on respect. In that confined space, with other travelers silently witnessing the interaction, a transformation was occurring. What began as a minor incident, a seat mistakenly taken, was evolving into a demonstration of authority, dignity, and the quiet power of observation and controlled action. The CEO knew that the next moments were critical. He had established his presence, conveyed authority through calm observation, and allowed the passenger to become increasingly aware of the mistake. But he also understood that true resolution required a response that was both subtle and impactful. It wasn't about confrontation for the sake of ego or anger, it was about reclaiming dignity, asserting boundaries, and demonstrating a quiet but undeniable command over the situation. In his years of leadership, he had discovered that the most effective responses often come from careful thought rather than impulsive action, and he approached this moment with the same strategic mindset that had guided countless boardroom victories and high-stakes negotiations. He allowed the silence to stretch just slightly longer, long enough for the weight of expectation to settle on the passenger. This pause was deliberate, almost imperceptible, but it carried an invisible pressure that was impossible to ignore. The passenger, initially relaxed and unconcerned, began to shift uneasily in his seat. His casual posture was now slightly defensive, a subtle tightening of the shoulders, a fleeting glance toward the CEO, a hesitant readjustment of his armrests, all small but telling signs that he was beginning to register the gravity of the situation. The CEO's eyes followed these micro-expressions, noting each one, understanding that the subtle psychological shifts were as powerful as any verbal confrontation. The passenger's initial confidence, rooted in entitlement and assumption, had started to crumble. He had presumed that the seat would remain his by default, that the CEO would simply accept the minor inconvenience. But the CEO's calm, deliberate presence had altered the dynamics entirely. Without a word, without aggression, he had created an environment in which the passenger's assumption of power was undermined by observation and silent authority. It was a demonstration of control that did not need volume or dramatics. The effect was in the quiet intensity, the unwavering posture, and the subtle cues that demanded recognition. As he prepared to act, the CEO considered the impact of timing and precision. Every gesture, every word, every pause would contribute to the overall effect. He understood the psychology of subtlety, the way a carefully measured response can be more powerful than immediate force. By allowing the passenger to reach the brink of discomfort, he was guiding him toward an internal realization, an acknowledgement that respect had been violated and that restitution was necessary. The CEO's approach was methodical, drawing upon years of experience where patience and calculated responses consistently produced the most favorable outcomes. He had learned that people often respond more effectively when they feel they are arriving at the conclusion themselves, rather than being dictated to, and he was using this principle now with quiet precision. The surrounding passengers were beginning to notice the shift in energy. There was a subtle ripple of awareness throughout the cabin, a sense that something unusual and compelling was occurring. Few would have guessed that a simple seat assignment could become a microcosm of authority, dignity, and strategy, yet the CEO was orchestrating it with deft attention to detail. Each observer, whether consciously or not, was witnessing a live demonstration of the quiet power of composure, the weight of presence, and the impact of strategic action over impulsive reaction. The CEO's mastery lay in making what appeared ordinary into a moment of subtle dominance and psychological insight, turning a minor inconvenience into a lesson in respect and awareness. The passenger now shifted more noticeably, his earlier nonchalance replaced by an uneasy awareness that he was out of alignment with the expectations of the space around him. The CEO, sensing the optimal moment, chose to assert his presence without hostility. He spoke, not with anger, but with the calm authority that demanded recognition, a polite yet firm reminder of the seat's rightful ownership. The words were carefully chosen, precise in delivery, and balanced in tone. They were not intended to shame, but to convey the necessary acknowledgement that boundaries and respect cannot be ignored. The effect was immediate, the passenger's posture altered further, subtle tension visible in the tightening of his hands, a quick glance downward, a realization dawning that the moment required his recognition and adjustment. In these critical moments, the CEO remained fully aware of the psychological dynamics at play. He understood that reclaiming dignity was not just about verbal assertion or reclaiming physical space, it was about guiding perception, shaping behavior, and creating a situation in which the passenger internalized the lesson on his own. The CEO's experience in leadership and negotiation had taught him that subtlety often trumps overt aggression, and here, on a crowded plane, the same principles applied. By allowing the passenger to process the misstep internally, by maintaining composure and projecting quiet authority, he ensured that the response would be effective, enduring, and respected by all observers. The surrounding passengers continued to sense the unfolding tension, though they remained largely silent, allowing the interaction to develop naturally. The CEO's presence created a ripple effect, influencing not just the passenger directly involved but also the broader environment. It was a demonstration of how controlled behavior, strategic patience, and thoughtful action can establish authority without confrontation, and how dignity can be defended effectively in situations that might otherwise seem trivial or inconsequential. Each movement, each word, each pause was calibrated to maximize impact while maintaining the integrity and composure that defined the CEO's approach. The passenger's realization became more pronounced as the CEO's steady presence and measured words reinforced the necessity of correction. He could no longer ignore the situation, no longer rely on assumption or casual entitlement. The CEO's quiet power had shifted the dynamic entirely, creating an environment in which acknowledgement was inevitable. The lesson was unfolding without spectacle, without raised voices, yet with clarity and authority. The subtle orchestration of observation, timing, and strategic response had guided the interaction toward a resolution that reaffirmed dignity, established respect, and reinforced the principle that no one space, no matter how seemingly trivial, should be taken without recognition and accountability. The passenger now sat with a noticeably different energy. What had once been casual confidence had shifted into an almost imperceptible defensiveness. He shifted slightly in his seat, as if trying to reclaim some sense of control, but the subtle tension in his posture betrayed a growing awareness that the situation was no longer in his favor. He had initially assumed the seat was a minor detail, an insignificant matter that required little more than a casual presence. Yet the CEO's quiet authority had transformed the interaction into something far more consequential than a simple seating issue. Each measured glance, every calm but unwavering movement of the CEO, conveyed the unspoken message: dignity, once challenged, must be reclaimed. The surrounding passengers, though physically removed from the interaction, could sense the subtle escalation. Some leaned slightly forward, pretending to read or check their phones, yet their peripheral awareness registered the silent exchange unfolding across the aisle. It was remarkable how a single act of entitlement, a mere assumption of ownership over a seat, had become a stage for a demonstration of character, patience, and power. The CEO, fully aware of these dynamics, allowed the situation to develop at its own pace, understanding that the most effective response often required timing, observation, and subtle guidance rather than immediate confrontation. The passenger fidgeted slightly, adjusting his bag and clearing his throat, perhaps realizing for the first time that his casual assumption had consequences. The CEO's eyes followed each movement, noting the small signs of hesitation, discomfort, and recognition. Every micro-expression was a window into the passenger's growing realization that he had overstepped boundaries. It was a fascinating study in human behavior, the way entitlement can mask awareness until confronted by composure and presence. The CEO, experienced in reading people and situations, recognized that the psychological shift was occurring, and that the moment for a strategic assertion of authority was approaching. As the CEO prepared to act, he considered the balance between firmness and subtlety. He did not wish to humiliate the passenger unnecessarily. The goal was not vengeance, but restoration of dignity and the establishment of respect. He knew that people often respond more effectively to a situation when they feel their own actions have consequences, when they are given the opportunity to recognize the error and adjust accordingly. By maintaining calm, observing carefully, and waiting for the right moment, the CEO ensured that his response would be both impactful and measured. The surrounding passengers, though largely silent, could feel the tension in the air, a quiet but palpable awareness of an unfolding lesson in respect and authority. The passenger's attempts at casual adjustment only highlighted his growing unease. He shifted in his seat, subtly straightened his back, and glanced toward the CEO as if searching for a signal or cue that might absolve him of responsibility. But the CEO's expression remained steady, calm, and unyielding. His presence alone conveyed the weight of authority, a silent insistence that the situation would not resolve itself without acknowledgement. It was a lesson in subtle dominance, the kind that does not rely on loud confrontation but on measured observation and strategic action. The passenger's internal realization was becoming evident. He had underestimated the man in the seat, and that miscalculation was beginning to cost him his composure. The flight attendants, moving discreetly through the aisle, had noticed the interaction but wisely chose to observe rather than intervene. There was an understanding that the situation was self-regulating, guided by the CEO's deliberate presence. They continued their duties with professional efficiency, yet the tension between the two men added an unusual undercurrent to the routine movements of passengers and staff alike. The CEO's mastery of the moment lay not in coercion but in the subtle orchestration of awareness, timing, and psychological influence. By allowing the passenger to confront his own mistake, he ensured the lesson would be understood on a deeper level, one that went beyond mere compliance. As the minutes passed, the passenger's demeanor continued to shift. He began to recognize the consequences of his assumption, the quiet authority of the man beside him, and the inevitability of restitution. There was a subtle softening in his posture, a slight acknowledgement of the error that had initially seemed insignificant. Each micro-movement, slight exhalations, the repositioning of his hands, the adjustment of his bag, reflected a growing internal acknowledgement that he had crossed a line. The CEO, reading these cues with practiced precision, knew that the moment for a decisive but subtle action was at hand. It was not enough for the passenger to simply move, he needed to internalize the lesson, to understand that respect and dignity are not negotiable, and that their violation carries consequences. The surrounding environment reinforced the tension. Passengers in neighboring rows, though not directly involved, had become unwitting witnesses to a subtle but powerful display of authority and composure. The CEO's actions, measured and deliberate, created a ripple effect, influencing not just the man in the seat but the broader atmosphere of the cabin. It was a demonstration of how presence, observation, and strategic patience can shift dynamics in even the most mundane settings. What began as a minor seating issue had evolved into a microcosm of human behavior, power, and the reclamation of dignity. The passenger, now visibly uneasy, made a small movement as if to vacate the seat. His earlier assumption and casual entitlement had been replaced by recognition, and though he may not have understood fully the depth of the lesson, he had begun to grasp the consequences of underestimating someone whose authority and dignity could not be easily challenged. The CEO, observing every nuance, knew that the subtle psychological shift had been achieved, that the passenger's recognition of his own misstep was complete, and that the environment around them had borne witness to a quiet but undeniable assertion of respect. The moment had finally reached its peak, though it was far from dramatic in the conventional sense. There were no raised voices, no shouting, no confrontation that would draw attention in a chaotic or disruptive way. Instead, the CEO's reclamation of dignity unfolded with the precision and subtlety that had defined his entire approach. Every movement, every measured glance, and every deliberate word worked together to restore the balance that had been temporarily disrupted. The passenger, who had initially assumed his seat without consideration, now faced the undeniable reality that he had trespassed not just physically, but symbolically, into someone else's domain, a domain defined not only by assigned numbers or tickets, but by the principles of respect, awareness, and accountability. The passenger's posture had shifted entirely. The casual confidence he had carried at the beginning of the interaction was replaced with a careful, almost hesitant attentiveness. His body language betrayed the realization that he was no longer the one in control, that the man beside him possessed a quiet authority that could not be ignored or overridden. The CEO observed these changes with a mixture of patience and precision, understanding that the subtle acknowledgement of wrongdoing was more powerful than any overt display of anger or retribution. By allowing the passenger to reach this point through his own recognition, he ensured that the lesson would be internalized, leaving a lasting impression far deeper than a simple request to vacate a seat could have achieved. As the passenger adjusted his position, a slight hesitation lingered in his movements. He seemed to wrestle internally with the contrast between his previous assumption and the present reality. There was a moment of cognitive dissonance, a quiet but intense confrontation within himself, where entitlement met authority and awareness. The CEO, standing calmly beside him, recognized the importance of timing in guiding this internal reckoning. A wrong word, a premature gesture, or any sign of impatience could have undermined the entire effect. Instead, he remained steadfast, allowing the passenger to experience fully the consequence of his own actions, ensuring that the acknowledgement of wrongdoing was voluntary and, therefore, more meaningful. Around them, the atmosphere of the cabin subtly shifted. Other passengers, though remaining largely silent, were now keenly aware that something extraordinary had occurred in an otherwise routine boarding process. It was remarkable how a single act of entitlement, taking a seat that did not belong to you, could escalate into a study of human behavior, authority, and dignity. Yet the CEO's methodical approach turned the ordinary into an extraordinary lesson. Each subtle cue, from his calm demeanor to his precise movements and carefully controlled expressions, communicated a message that needed no amplification. The passenger's realization had become public in its effect, even if private in its internalization. The CEO now made a minimal yet deliberate move, a shift that subtly reclaimed the space without aggression. He gestured slightly toward the aisle, enough to indicate the rightful ownership of his seat, without making it appear confrontational or dramatic. This act, though understated, carried immense weight. It was the culmination of the strategy he had applied from the moment he first noticed the passenger sitting in his place. Every previous pause, every measured glance, every silent observation had led to this precise assertion of presence. It was not a battle of volume or force, it was the restoration of balance through intelligence, observation, and self-control. The passenger's response was telling. His earlier confidence had fully dissipated, replaced by acknowledgement and, perhaps for the first time, genuine understanding of the situation. He adjusted himself, almost imperceptibly, and began to comply with the unspoken expectation that he had overstepped. There was no need for verbal confrontation because the lesson had been absorbed internally. The CEO's ability to guide the passenger to this realization without overt confrontation reflected his mastery of subtle influence, demonstrating that dignity and authority are most effectively reclaimed when the other party recognizes the error themselves. Even as the passenger shifted to correct the situation, the CEO maintained a composed and respectful demeanor. There was no gloating, no unnecessary display of triumph. Instead, there was an unmistakable restoration of equilibrium. This approach reinforced the principle that true power is exercised with control, subtlety, and strategic awareness, rather than through anger or dramatic displays. It was a quiet but definitive victory, a reclamation of dignity that had been momentarily challenged yet never threatened in essence. The surrounding passengers continued to observe in varying degrees of awareness. Some were conscious of every subtle gesture and micro-expression, appreciating the psychological interplay at work. Others remained unaware of the intricate dynamics but still felt the tension dissipate as the situation resolved itself. The CEO's handling of the scenario had transformed a seemingly minor conflict into a demonstration of composure, authority, and strategic intelligence. It was a lesson in how dignity, once challenged, can be quietly but effectively reclaimed, turning an ordinary moment into an enduring example of leadership and presence. Finally, the passenger settled fully into his corrected position. The CEO had achieved the objective without raising his voice, without confrontation, and without unnecessary spectacle. The reclamation of dignity was complete in a way that reinforced the principle that respect is earned, acknowledged, and maintained through action, composure, and subtle influence. The subtle but undeniable shift in the passenger's demeanor, combined with the quiet acknowledgement of surrounding witnesses, confirmed that the balance had been restored, and that the CEO's quiet mastery of the moment had achieved its intended impact.